Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. We've got a great crowd and really looking forward to this panel. I'm Rob Blanton. I'm a professor and chair of the Department of Political Science and Public Administration. I'm very happy to welcome you today for our webinar on the Ukrainian crisis, implications for geopolitics and human rights. I'd first like to thank the IHR for hosting this panel and to the tireless work of its director, Dr. Tina Reuter, in putting this together so quickly. I'd also like to thank our co-sponsors, including my department, as well as the CAS, as well as the departments of Anthropology and History. Now, before I introduce our speakers, I'd like to point out a few things on your screen. As a reminder, the webinar is available in a listen-only mode. If you have any questions for our speakers, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Our speakers will answer questions or receive comments after the presentations. Additionally, we are providing live captioning for the event, which can be enabled through the bottom menu as well. I want to start off before introducing the speakers by giving a very brief and incomplete sort of update on on what's going on in the current conflict. As of this afternoon, Russian gains are mostly in the southern part of the Ukraine. They've captured the port city of Kherson, which is the first major target to fall under de facto Russian control. And Russia's also bombarded multiple other cities with reports of civilian casualties. Now, from the onset, Russian troops have been trying to move to the capital of Kyiv. Russian troops are trying to surround it, though major troop movements, particularly along military convoy, have made little progress in the last few days amid a combination of very spirited Ukrainian defenses as well as logistical problems. There have been reports of fairly substantial Russian military casualties. Russia puts the official estimate at 498, though Ukraine puts the figures at closer to 6,000. UN reports also indicate that over 1 million people have fled the Ukraine since the invasion began. And estimates that the figure could increase to upwards of 5 million, which is 1/8 of their total population. In the meantime, Russia is undergoing a financial crisis as their currency values have plummeted due to a crippling array of sanctions that have effectively isolated Russia economically. And despite heavy state control over the media as well as civil society, there are indications that Russians are becoming aware of the war, as numerous protests have emerged that have resulted in over 7,000 arrests. Now, let me introduce the panelists. Dr. George Lieber is a retired professor in the Department of History. He's worked extensively in the Ukraine, and his most recent book is entitled Total Wars in the Making of Modern Ukraine, 1914 to 1954. Also pleased to welcome Scotty Colson. He's a coordinator at the Jimmy Hale Mission, an assistant to the mayor of Birmingham, and also Alabama's Honorary Consul for Ukraine. Dr. Tina Reuter is associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, as well as the Department of Anthropology, and she is the director of the IHR, the Institute for Human Rights. Dr. Renato Corbetta is an associate professor in the Department of Political Science and Public Administration, and also the director of our International Studies program. And finally, Dr. Verbeek is associate professor in the Department of Anthropology and director of the MA program in Anthropology of Peace and Human Rights. Now, turning first to Dr. Lieber. As a historian, could you tell us what the recent historical background is to the current conflict? What brought us to where we are today? You're muted, George. Dr. Lieber.
Okay, can you hear me now? Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me to this panel. Since the collapse of the Soviet Union 30 years ago, Ukraine has been an independent country, hoping to steer itself between Russia and while charting its own independent political future. Ukrainians have chosen a pro-Western, pro-democratic direction with free elections and civil liberties. They have established one of the most vibrant civil societies in the entire post-Soviet region. Ukraine has become a political beacon for those living under authoritarian rule and a home for many liberal Russians and Belarusians who have fled their oppressive homelands. But President Putin has never recognized the independence of Ukraine and its aspirations to join the wider world. Putin is obsessed with Russia's historical past and with Russia's current place in the world. In order to restore Russia as a great power, as he hopes to do, he needs to subordinate Ukraine. Since the year 2000, Putin has become a highly authoritarian leader, and he has acquired unlimited power in Russia with no checks and balances. He controls the parliament, he controls the courts, he controls all state media. He has devastated Russia's civil society. Even in the age of the internet, he shapes Russian public opinion. And against the will of many Russians, he has launched this unprovoked and unjustified invasion of Ukraine. He seeks to overturn Ukraine's independence and its democratic experiment.
All right, thank you.
Did you want me, is there another question?
Just what brought us here?
What brought us here? Two major events. Thank you. The first, in February 2014, the Euromaidan revolution removed a highly pro-Russian and highly corrupt president of Ukraine, and in his place installed a democratic pro-Western government. President Putin did not like these results, and he then invaded Ukraine, annexed Crimea, and actively supported pro-Russian annexationists in eastern Ukraine. These pro-Russian annexationists engaged the Ukrainian government in a low-intensity conflict for the past 8 years. Putin now wants to break this stalemate. The second event, beyond this one, nearly 8 years ago, is what happened last summer. That is, with the chaotic withdrawal of US forces from Afghanistan after 20 years of fighting, Putin imagines that the United States was weak and ineffectual on the world stage. He thought that he could grab Ukraine for himself and drive a wedge between the United States and its NATO allies. Instead, Putin's invasion of Ukraine has united the United States, NATO, the European Union, and even the United Nations against Russia. Most importantly, he has united all Ukrainians against him.
Great, thank you, Dr. Lieber.
Thank you.
All right, turning to Scotty Colson, we were just talking about a little bit ago how your phone has been ringing off the hook. Could you tell us a little bit about what you're hearing about what is the current situation on the ground, and just what kind of things are you hearing?
My pleasure. I want to correct one thing on my bio. I was in the mayor's office from 83 to 2018 and Jimmy Hill full time. Please give, we do good stuff in what you give. There's my shameless plug. But yeah, as honorary consul, we've been getting 4 briefings a day from the embassy as well as the State Department and several Zoom meetings with the ambassador. In 12 years as honorary consul, I've begged and pleaded for attention for Ukraine. In the last 8 days, I've had 500 calls, 350 of which were people looking to join the Ukrainian Legion. 120, 140, about 140 of them for people looking to try to be part of a humanitarian effort. And then the rest are people looking for constituent service for family there and things of that nature. So it has been an extremely busy time for an unpaid job. I want to answer this question by talking about 3 young people that are my friends who've been to Birmingham as part of the Open World program. Open World is a program Congress does to bring leaders and potential leaders from the former Soviet republics here, and they spend a week and a half and they learn and they participate in many programs out here. And we've hosted about 20 of those over the years. And I want to talk about Maxime. Maxime is a member of the Rada, the elected parliament. Maxime is a lawyer, and he's part of the effort to bring democratization and reform to Ukraine. Maxime is, like the rest of the Rada, is in Kyiv. They are at their duty, they're at their desk, as the city is being bombarded and being besieged. I was talking to him before Russian interference was able to knock me off of Facebook. That's one thing the Russians are doing. The advocates in this country is they're attacking and trying to knock us off of social platforms. And they've been successful with me thus far. But Maxime was talking about how he had never fired a gun. He'd been issued his AK-47. They gave him 50 rounds, and I suggested he try to find a quiet place to try it out for a couple of rounds just to see which way the bullets go, because he'd never fired a gun. But he is ready there as a member of parliament. When he finishes his work, he goes and he mans a barricade in Kyiv. I want to talk about Feder. Feder was here 2 years ago, a wonderful young man, an entrepreneur. His business is teaching people and helping people get programs for first aid. Feder is now one of the main leaders of providing triage and first aid assistance on the front lines around Kyiv. Then you have Dasha, a young woman. I think Dasha may be 30 now, but probably a little bit below that because she was very young when she came here at 22. And Dasha is, the last thing she sent me was a picture of her standing outside of the airport in Venezia, sister city, with a machine gun and ready to defend. So these are people who have, these are people I know. These are people who've been to Birmingham, who've met some of the people who are on this call, who understand something about this town. So we have a connection there. These are people who have a true love of Birmingham, and they learned that in Birmingham, we were able to change our government and our society and how we approach things. And that was the whole point of Open World. And there's an entire group of 40, 50 young people, young leaders in Ukraine, who are veterans of the Open World program, who call themselves the Birmingham group. They're members of parliament, they're mayors, they're city council members. They run ministries and nonprofits. And so when we look at the people fighting Ukraine, realize that there are people out there who have been inspired by this town and who have been to UAB. Go Blazers.
Thank you. And thank you for putting such a personal touch on that, letting us that. Well, it's turning to Dr. Reuter. You could tell us a little bit about the humanitarian consequences. I know there's been some movement at the ICC recently about war crimes. Can you tell us a little bit about the humanitarian consequences? I mean, what types of violations are we seeing?
Yes, thank you for this question. Obviously, well, let me start with the human rights violations. I spent my day today digging into this, and I know it's made me highly emotional, I must be honest, because what we see is a increased human rights violations, especially right to life and physical integrity of civilians. So bombardment of civilians and civilian infrastructure in violation of international law has really increased over the last couple of days. You know, as you just mentioned, the International Criminal Court is starting an investigation. We'll see, you know, what this all means. What's really troubling to me is that this seems on purpose. Like when we, you know, you might have read about the most recent talks between President Putin and President Macron. You know, he was basically saying he would go to the bloody end. And we've seen these tactics before in Chechnya, in Georgia, in Syria. It seems to be kind of the Russian MO, so to speak. So shelling from heavy artillery, multi-launch rocket systems, airstrikes are mostly responsible for these casualties. It's really unclear with regards to numbers, how many people have died. The UN said yesterday that 227 civilians have been killed and 525 injured. The Ukrainian government was talking about 2,000 people. So it's really hard to know. We know that children have been killed. Again, unclear how many. So casualty counts in times of war, even in times of social media, are skewed by many factors, including propaganda, misinformation campaigns, the fluidity and unpredictability of attacks, and security threats to those officially tasked with assessing the toll. So For example, the UN Human Rights Office that keeps tally of the casualties will only count people who they can independently verify, so cross-check with multiple sources, interview, and so on. So this is very likely a heavy undercount of the actual count. So civilian casualties are obviously a problem. Humanitarian implications, there's millions of people who are internally displaced, especially fleeing towards the west of the country or seeking shelter underground. The UN estimates that at least 160,000 people in Ukraine have fled the war or displaced within their own country. The EU just issued a statement saying this figure will probably climb to 7 million, when 18 million Ukrainians will be affected by the war. It's really difficult to help those people internally displaced because the war is making it unsafe for aid workers to go there. As was just recently mentioned, I think you, Rob, mentioned this. Ukraine and Russia have reached a tentative agreement to organize a safe corridor for civilians to evacuate and for humanitarian supplies to be delivered. Hoping this will truly come through. Other than that, as Dr. Blanton already mentioned, more than 1 million people have fled the country. That's about 2% of the country's total population. About half of these refugees are in Poland. The rest of them is distributed across the other bordering countries of Hungary, Moldova, and Slovakia. And many have left those border countries and actually moved on farther to Europe. And if you look at some of the situation on the border crossing, like many people waited up to 60 hours to cross into Poland in freezing weather, and so on. It's really a growing issue. The European Commission has just issued a statement that as much as 4 million people will flee the Ukraine. So this could become Europe's largest refugee crisis in this century. The EU decided today that it will grant Ukrainian nationals, as well as foreigners who have been long-term residents, refugees, or asylum seekers in Ukraine, a blanket right to stay and work throughout the EU for 1 year with a potential extension for another 2 years. They will also receive social welfare and access to housing, medical treatment, and schooling for children, and can apply for long-term asylum if they would like to do that. So there's a warm welcome and lots of solidarity, not just on the country level, but also in the community. My parents, like, I'm from Switzerland, for those of you who don't know, I've talked to them this morning, and they mentioned all the fundraising initiatives across my hometown, and the people coming together. You might have read that in the German town of Hamburg, school authorities announced that children were allowed to skip classes today to join a peace strike. There's a Facebook group full of people across the globe offering Ukrainian refugees temporary homes, and Airbnb is offering free short-term housing, and Wizz Air, a Hungarian ultra-low-cost carrier, is offering free seats and a cheap rescue fare through March. I mean, this is all wonderful. I do want to say, though, and just from a human rights point of view, this warm embrace of Ukrainian refugees is in stark contrast to the European refugee crisis in 2015, when more than 1 million refugees, most of them fleeing from conflict in the Middle East and Africa, poured into Europe, which really spurred an anti-immigrant backlash and feigning support for political parties with anti-immigrant policies. So while this solidarity shown to Ukrainian refugees is wonderful and welcome overall, it is a little bit troubling that it seems to be prioritizing aid to white Christians over, Europe's collective responsibility to help others fleeing conflict in other parts of the world. Thank you.
All right, yeah, thank you, Dr. Reuter. It is a very complex situation. I think you spelled out a lot of that really, yes, succinctly. I guess turning now to Dr. Corbetta, from your perspective as sort of a conflict scholar, right? What options does the international community and the U.S. have to intervene? Talk a little bit about that, and talk a little bit about, I'd like to hear a little bit about the sanctions. Are they working, and what can we do politically?
So first of all, thank you, Dr. Reuter, for working so hard to put the panel together so fast, and for inviting us all. So let me address the two issues separately, although clearly they are related to one another. And I'll tackle the issue of intervention first. And you may have heard plenty of reporters and policymakers asking why isn't the United States intervening? You may have heard President Biden having to explain on a regular basis that the United States is not going to put boots on the ground in Ukraine, and the reason for this is it goes back to dynamics of from the Cold War that we are all reliving right now, and the answer is it's all because of nuclear weapons. We are dealing with the country that has a nuclear arsenal that is equal to to that of the United States, and if not, probably even larger in terms of count of nuclear warheads. The Cold War was dominated by this fear that conventional deployment of conventional troops will lead to an escalation to a nuclear conflict. And that's clearly what's going on right now. The United States and any country from NATO is probably of course cannot put any soldier on the ground because of the fear of that the conflict will eventually escalate to the nuclear level, and it doesn't it doesn't take a whole lot for that to happen. It doesn't have to be an explicit aggression by, say, Russia against nuclear troops or the other way. I'm sorry, NATO troops or the other way around. It may just be just a random accident while the troops are stationed in front of one another. They may lead to the use of nuclear weapons. It's a well-known issue in many ways in the conflict community. It's gone down as termed as the stability paradox. That if you the idea is that the conventional forces cannot be used because the use of conventional fighting will lead to the escalation of to the nuclear escalation. But on the other hand, the threat of the use of nuclear weapons leaves room for the use of conventional forces. So countries have to edge, in both directions. They have to, but the fear that conventional fighting will lead to nuclear fighting is always there. So the question here at this point is, how credible is the threat that NATO and or Russia will use nuclear forces? And you may have heard a lot of saber rattling by Putin in the last few days, talking about the use of nuclear weapons, and that's exactly what he's trying to do. He's trying to boost the credibility that Russia will actually use nuclear weapons, so that in case of need, so that there will be no stationing of conventional troops by NATO or by the United States in Ukraine. Right. So, given that we are dealing with this dilemma, with the dilemma of the presence of nuclear weapons, what are the options left to the international community? Well, the direct option is clearly what we have been doing so far, and that's sanctions. Sanctions is one of the few avenues that are available to the West. And this leads to the issue of whether sanctions work or not. Now, the evidence about the effectiveness of sanctions is mixed. Although we know that when they work slowly, and this is the problem. The fact that the sanctions are a screw that you tight. Slower and slower, and so the United States has been doing exactly that. So there have been questions posed to the president or why the United States is not going full blown with nuclear sanctions is that you want them to operate progressively. You don't want them to impose all of a sudden and do all of you can do, because otherwise you have nothing left in your bag of tricks, so to speak. Now, so they can work, but the fact that it works slowly works in favor of Russia, because that may allow Putin to put us all in front of a fait accompli by the time that the sanctions kick in and start really hurting Russia. Now, the sanctions that West has imposed are very strong. They are already imposing a lot of pain, not just to the oligarchs, but also to average Russian citizens. And so you may wonder, people have been, asking whether the hurt imposed by the sanctions will lead Russian citizens to essentially boot Putin out of office, and that's a question that is really difficult to address. It's probably very unlikely. And there's another component here, and that component is probably China. My wild guess is that Putin, right before the conflict, made a bet, and he made a bet that China would be able to absorb what Russia cannot sell to the West, and that Russia could be getting from China what it cannot get from the West. So a lot of what's going on right now really edges on what China is going to do in the next few in the next few weeks or so. And one option that is left to the Western community is to try to peel China away from Russia as much as possible, and to try to get some assurance from China that they will not step in to fill the gap that has been left by that has been created by all of the sanctions. And the Chinese have been very inscrutable up to now. It's really unclear what they're going to do. On the one hand, they are very tempted to let the events roll out as they are, because the temptations that they will establish a precedent for them to take over Taiwan is right there, and it's undeniable. But on the other hand, they are afraid of a backlash from the international community that's already pretty strong. So given this situation, the other options that is left to the international community beyond sanctions is to try to make as much room for negotiation as possible, possibly offers by international organizations, by the United Nations, to mediate between the two parties. And there's also, the possibility that if the Russian offensive is not as successful as it is looking, that Russia may be willing to accept some level of mediation from the West. There's always the option of old Cold War style peacekeeping. If some neutral troops put in peacekeepers on the ground to keep the two parties separate, well, although that's again very unlikely. But and even if mediation takes place, there's always the question that is unanswerable of whether Russia is really willing to negotiate in good faith, and so far that has not been the case.
Great, thank you, Dr. Corbetta. I guess turning to Dr. Verbeek, as a peace scholar, could you tell us a little bit about sort of what peace proposals have been suggested? I know there've been a couple rounds of talks thus far, and what do you think is the prospect for peace and what's needed to get there? Just kind of feeding off some of the stuff that Dr. Corbetta had brought up. Oh, you're on mute. I'm sorry.
Thanks so much.
All right.
I would like to start also with thanking Dr. Reuter for putting this together, and to you, Dr. Blanton, for guiding us along. Yeah, peace. When we look at peace, we often distinguish between two components to peace: negative peace and positive peace. Right now, we're in a situation that we really need negative peace. Negative peace meaning the cessation of violence, and so that should be our primary focus. But it's wrong to suppose that once violence ends, that then peace comes, because positive means dealing with the situation at hand, which may be structural violence in countries, social injustice, discrimination, all kinds of facts that may prevent peace from happening in full. And so that's important to keep in mind when we think about peace. It's also important to think about peace as a process, not something that is some utopian end goal, but it is something that needs to be worked on over time. And maybe we need to continue working on for a long time and forever. I think this situation here also should motivate us to think critically about ourselves. I think, and we need to avoid to think in terms of focusing too much on who is the perpetrator here and who is the victim, because there are victims on both sides, I think. I saw a quote from NHK, Japanese public television, that showed during the meeting of the United Nations General Assembly, I think it was a representative from Ukraine who held up a cell phone of a Russian soldier who had died. And on the cell phone were text messages from his mother, sort of asking him, can I send you a package? What do you need? And he sort of answered, well, you can, because I'm being deployed and there's no way to get this to me. And he also wrote to his mother that we were told that the Ukrainians would be welcoming us with open arms, but actually they're firing at us and the situation is completely different. So I think we should think about the human aspect on both sides and not sort of extrapolating from what leaders like Putin may do to the Russian people, for example. I also think that this is maybe a time for unusual courage. Maybe as a United Nations, maybe as the leader of the Western world, we may should engage in an initiative to get to talk with Putin. If it's necessary to go there, then maybe we should do so. We are, in my opinion, de facto in war with Russia because of the sanctions that we are applying. We're using different means. We're not directly killing people, but we're still using violence to some extent to engaging another nuclear power. And as already has been pointed out, that's a very risky situation because things may get out of hand very quickly in terms of the nuclear situation. I think we should also critically think about why NATO is there and whether or not there's a future for it. It's a relic, I think, from the Cold War. This whole situation should be seen in a very complex historical perspective. But do we need this military alliance to fight the Soviet Union that doesn't exist anymore? People say it's necessary because of the threat of Iran. That may be true. But maybe we should think critically whether or not we need to consider to continue with doing things the way we've done them so far, because of course it's an important issue in terms of how Russia and Putin in particular looks at the world. So I think it's a time where we need to be thinking out of the box, so to speak, and come up with maybe approaches that hasn't been practiced in the past, but that are first and foremost aimed at stopping the violence, making sure that refugees are finding a way out, a safe way out, and are being treated well. And then from there on, reassess the situation for the future. But I think we should be careful to take sides in terms of saying, well, this is because there are aggressors and victims in every conflict. And I think it's important to keep that in mind. In terms of human rights, all kinds of human rights are violated all over the place. I think that is clear. But one right that people really should talk about more are children's rights. We have the United Nations Convention on the Rights of the Child, which is the most ratified convention on rights that we have. All countries, with the exception of one, the United States, have ratified this convention. And I think we should bring this up. We should talk about the suffering of children, and that we need to stop. Russia has ratified this convention, so it should be part of our discussions. We don't hear much about children, and children are often the first victims in situations like this. So I think it's very important to think about that as well. Yeah, there are some talks going on in Belarus that we heard about. There are also, I think, plans to resume these talks. President Zelensky has asked for Putin to meet with him. I don't know more about the details, but he has asked for it. Maybe if that is so, maybe we should join him, or the European Union representative should join him. At any rate, I think we should look at this creatively and differently than we have done so in the past. It's very important for people to talk. As long as the guns are going and people are not talking, peace will be far away. But the moment people start talking, and particularly when a nice collection of people with different opinions start talking together, maybe good ideas may emerge. So I think rather than focusing on sanctions, I think we should think about a way of getting back to the table and to talk. A word about the sanctions. I think behavioral science shows very clearly that punishment doesn't work. That's just the fact, and these sanctions are punishment. I think we've seen in the past that they're not very effective. We're acknowledging that they're not effective. I know it's difficult to come up with other means other than dialogue, but I think we need to keep that in mind. I have very little expectations that this form of punishment will do any good or will stop behavior and change behavior, because that's what we're after. We want to change behavior. We want to stop the killing and then change behavior. But I'm not sure that that will come from the sanctions as we have them now.
All right, thank you. Raise a lot of challenging issues here. I'm going to turn to the Q&A. I'd remind everyone in the audience to submit questions through the Q&A. We're getting a lot of really good ones here, and I'm going to try to sort of streamline things and see how many we can get through. Y'all bring up some really interesting issues. We've got a question from Nicole Watkins, who I guess is one of Dr. Lieber's former students. And she's got a question in two parts, and this is kind of links to some of the stuff that Dr. Verbeek brought up. She's seen arguments presented in recent weeks that NATO actions precipitated this conflict pretty much since the end of the Cold War by engaging in political brinksmanship with Russia over former Eastern Bloc nations. And her question is in two parts. I mean, do you think that the NATO issue is true, that building up NATO served to precipitate this? And do you think that de-escalation is possible now? Have we backed Putin into a corner?
To answer that question, no to the first and no to the second. In terms of the first one, about NATO is the villain in all of this, and Mr. Putin is an innocent bystander who is protecting his sphere of influence. I believe that's really totally untrue. And the way that Mr. Putin has presented this is of NATO expansion into Eastern Europe. It's kind of it's a propaganda kind of way of looking at the world. It's essentially NATO inclusion. That is, all of the East European countries which became part of NATO after 1991 willingly and enthusiastically wanted to become NATO members in order to prevent what's happening in Ukraine. And so and NATO has not done anything to provoke Russia in regard to this issue. And Russia has raised this whole issue about it can't accept various members from Eastern Europe. And of course, NATO has responded, well, how do you, who is not a member of NATO, determine our membership? So essentially what we have here is a problem of whether the people, the various countries which emerged after the revolutions of 1989 and 1991 in Eastern Europe and in the Soviet Union, former Soviet Union, whether they have the right to determine their own political future or not. And it's very obvious that if you are not a member of NATO at this point in time, one's political future is an open question. And the second point, I guess, quickly to answer that, is de-escalation possible now? Well, it's possible, but all of this really lies at the hands of Mr. Putin. Essentially, what we have here is he has the high ground, and not in terms of any moral issue, but rather he has the more advantages in all of this than does Ukraine or NATO or the United States. And it's essentially, it's coming to his decision whether he escalates this or he de-escalates this. And apparently from a conversation that President Putin had with President Macron of France this morning, President Macron's office asserted that the worst is still to come. So it doesn't seem like this is going to be a de-escalation.
Thank you. Trying to sort through some of the other ones. An interesting issue brought up is sort of, got a question from Laura Neal Walker. What does it mean for the future of international relations? And this is something multiple of us could weigh in. The countries like Switzerland and Germany have joined against taking action against Russia. We've got a couple questions with the theme that this seems to be almost a universal sort of unification against Russian actions. So what are some of the broader implications of that?
Yeah, I think what we should not lose sight of is that this is a horrible situation and people are dying needlessly and we need to stop it. But we have bigger fish, we have other problems, to deal with. And we have existential problems such as climate change, biodiversity loss that concern all of us. And ultimately, we will need all of us to deal with this. We cannot do it on our own. And we will need Russia and we need everyone. And so whatever we are planning right now and whatever we are doing to stop the current killing, we must do so with that in the back of our mind. Because recently, or just a few days ago, the report from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change came out. That's not getting a lot of attention because we're right in the middle of our emphasis on this war. But it's a very alarming message, which makes it very clear that we're already feeling the effects of climate change all over, and that we will need everybody to make sure that we at least mitigate it and assure, that we can continue to live as a human species as we have lived in the past. So whatever we are negotiating right now to end this war, this is what should be in the back of our mind. We need everybody.
So in terms of Switzerland, I saw that there was a couple of questions. That's actually a good point. It's the very first time where we have, Switzerland moving, to support sanctions like that. And so some of it has to do with the fact that Switzerland actually did join the United Nations. And, obviously the crossing of borders is a great breach of international law and the United Nations Charter, Article 2, Paragraph 4, that prohibits the use of force in international relations. And so it also was the public opinion that was very strongly in support of the Ukraine and of Ukrainian efforts similar in Germany.
Yeah, I want to say something about that, Dr. Reuter. I respect and appreciate, you know, what the Swiss people want, and I'm glad that the government has acted on that. But I'm also sad about it, because what we need, and Switzerland has done good work like that in the past, we need probably a neutral country or neutral countries who can host maybe peace talks, who can mediate. It's very difficult to have negotiations be successful if the only participants are partisan, and it's taking place like now in Belarus, for example, in a partisan place. So I'm a little bit sad that we lost Switzerland for that. I appreciate and respect their reasons, but at the same time, I'm disappointed a little bit.
Okay. There's a few questions I think it's be interesting for some of us on the panel to explore about the how big of a component is oil to this issue, because that does sort of, it's a nice complexity there, the role of oil. Anybody want to take a first stab at that one?
Well, you know, I think Dr. Verbeek's comment on the climate change and war is interesting. I think we'll actually probably see more war. I do believe that Putin's next target will be the North Pole. The Russians have expanded their capability with icebreakers beyond anybody else's. They've dropped a flag onto the North Pole, under the water. So when you get right down to it, as John McCain said, Russia is a gas station with an army. And when you're addicted to a substance, you will do anything your pusher wants you to do. We are addicted to fossil fuel. He understands that, and he understands that he is the supply, and he is our pusher, and we're the addict. And he also has plans for the North Pole, the opening of the new Northwest Passage because of global warming. So this is not just a game of checkers for the environment that Vladimir Putin and his henchmen are pulling.
Thanks. And I would add, in the short term, in terms of oil, what oil means now is that's basically Russia's only way to get revenue. They're not able to access any of their assets in order to prop their currency up.
Well, they have natural gas too.
Yes, and the natural gas.
Natural gas is the number one. They export. They're the number one world's exporter of natural gas.
Mm-hmm. And those apparently, yeah, that's for Russia now. That's one of their few sources of hard currency. Since they've been frozen out from everything else. That's about the last thing that hasn't fallen in terms of their engagement in the global economy. So. Now, there's a couple questions about sort of the implications here for the Russian people. If Putin fails or does something where he's considered a failure, what do you think, what will happen to the Russian people? Both those who are for and against Putin.
If I can answer that, it's fairly unclear. Essentially, we are kind of in the early kind of phase of this war of Russia against Ukraine, and so it's very difficult to gauge what the popular opinion is in Russia, and to what extent Russian attitudes may be changing as they learn more about the war, and how many Russian soldiers are killed in this war. So it's pretty unclear what may happen in the future. I believe at this point, President Putin is standing over a society which is, if one believes kind of the state media, which a certain group of people in Russia over the age of 50 view religiously, as opposed to asking younger people who use the internet, there may be varying points of, there may be differences in terms of the younger Russians on the one hand and the older ones on the other. But at this point, I believe that President Putin's position is quite secure. But as the sanctions will begin to hit, the Russian people will also be hit. And so it then becomes a question whether they will blame the West and NATO and the European Union for all these sanctions as the Putin administration claims, or whether they'll blame Putin himself. And it's kind of a dark and murky situation, and I think it's unclear which way it may go.
Yeah, thank you. Another issue that I'm seeing here, a few questions we're getting about, and this is kind of, we've sort of touched on adjacent issues. What do you think is Putin, what's Putin's grand plan here? I mean, he's talked about the immediate goals. Anyone want to hazard a guess as to his grand plan, or does one exist?
If I may, Rob. It's really difficult to say what the grand plan is, but if we look at the intentions, is the plan is to reestablish Russia to its old status. Putin is still chewing on some issues that have stuck with him, from 20-30 years ago when the Soviet Union fell apart. And he has been unable to letting that go, and in many ways chart a new path for Russia. The only thing that he's been able to see is a return to the past, and that's exactly what he's trying to do. He's trying to is many ways has been afraid that that Russia is going to be the junior partner to the U.S.-China relationship. And this is that's the move, and that's part of the expansion to the North Pole and to the Arctic that Mr. Colson was talking about, and there isn't a particular economic gain or some other type of goal that he may have in mind. This is as far as I can see, this is just a matter of status.
Anybody else want to take a stab at that one?
Well, Putin does like money. He is likely the richest man in the world because there is very little difference between his fortune and the Russian treasury. So I think that when we look at his strategy, it is to create a new Russian empire, but as a Russian empire that controls all of the resources of the North, as well as being able to undermine the West. As a couple of Russian consultants once told me over dinner in the Donbass, that their goal was to do tough what we did to them, break us up, and have us become contentious among ourselves and show democracy doesn't work and bring us to their level. And I laughed, and I really do need to track down those guys and apologize, because they told me exactly what their plan is.
Thank you. Here's more of a, this one gets into more of the sort of international relations aspect of it, about sort of the role or non-role of the UN in this situation. The UN Security Council has the authority to use physical force under the UN Charter, though obviously that's not going to be likely given the fact that Russia as a permanent member can veto anything. Is there a viable option to override Russia's veto power and enforce international humanitarian and international human rights law violations against Russia's government?
Well, not really. I mean, there's been a vote in the General Assembly, as you probably saw, with a couple of very interesting abstentions, and also 5 countries that voted against which were Russia, Belarus, Syria, North Korea, and Eritrea. Surprise, no one. There isn't really in the UN, right? It's like we have to remember that the UN was established at the end of World War II, representing the situation, the power situation at the end of World War II. So it is not truly representative of the way the power structure is today. And obviously the veto power has been one of the big stumbling blocks. There haven't been a lot of situations in which the UN has been able to authorize force if one of the great powers, namely the US, the Russia, or China was directly implicated. So I don't think that there will be a clear way through the UN. Obviously, the vote in the General Assembly is a signal. There are other ways, right, in which the international community has worked together through other types of institution and other channels, but not necessarily through the United Nations, which again is blocked because of those veto powers.
Yeah, I think in terms of the United Nations, this is one of the things that I'm thinking about. And when I said we need to start thinking critically about, things that we have traditionally accepted to be there. For example, we definitely need to rethink how the United Nations operate. In terms of peacekeeping, for example, both countries would have to invite them in, even if there is a vote in the Security Council. So that's a stumbling block in some sense. But I still think we need a body like the United Nations to deal with the problems that we have, again, in particular climate change and so on. So we must find ways to do this better, because there are very strong votes coming from the global community. Now here, 145 countries voting for the resolution, which shows that the majority of the world supports Ukraine. There's also strong support for nuclear disarmament. And as Dr. Corbetta mentioned, this is happening under the nuclear umbrella, so to speak. Putin can operate because there is this nuclear umbrella that both Russia and we maintain and sustain, and we need to start thinking critically about that as well. That needs to change, and we need to put our efforts into nuclear disarmament. Otherwise, events like this will repeat itself.
If I can say something on that issue of nuclear disarmament, Ukraine was the first major country in the world to nuclearly disarm between 1994 and 1996. And this is the situation Ukraine is in. Ukraine bargained in terms of this agreement. It was pressured by the United States and by other nuclear powers to give up its nuclear weapons in return for a guarantee of its its territorial integrity and national sovereignty. This has been violated. Of course, one can argue, well, this agreement had no binding force, but I think that this idea of nuclear disarmament, there's no country which is going to give up its nuclear arms if they have it after Ukraine did so and has now been invaded. And if one imagines that in the near future, Iraq is going to give up its potential to gain nuclear weapons, I believe you're sadly mistaken. As well as other countries. But I believe on the whole that, but even in terms of the United Nations, in terms of rethinking the United Nations, it's essentially the only major international organization in the world, because no one on the Security Council of the 5 great powers is going to give up its veto power. So essentially, the United Nations is what it is at this point. And what one can do positively through the United Nations is good, but to recognize that it has weaknesses, and its weaknesses will not be amended by the members of the Security Council, including the United States.
Thank you, Dr. Lieber. I would add that I was just about to ask that very question about nuclear disarmament. We had a question in the Q&A about that very issue, that there are some perverse incentives in terms of disarmament. I think the case of Libya is also illustrative in that regards, right? They got rid of their weapons, and look what happened. So there are definitely some perverse incentive structures out there. A couple different questions that I want to sort of join. I've got one question about the role. What role, if any, is anti-Semitism playing, and could it become a major weapon against Western cohesion? And again, sort of a related issue. You've heard what Putin keeps saying is that he's attacking, taking out Nazis in the Ukraine, which most people sort of think is a fairly ridiculous point, given the fact that they have a Jewish president. But if anyone wants to, comment on that issue, sort of the role of anti-Semitism and sort of the role of this rhetoric about wiping out Nazis. Dr. Lieber, I saw your hand.
The issue of anti-Semitism is one which is somewhat of a I think a non-issue in this case. That is, as Russia is invading Ukraine, this is not a major issue. That is, this issue is not there because everyone in Ukraine is suffering, whatever their ethnic or national belonging or their religious beliefs. That is, bombing cities does not discriminate or promote one group over another. Everyone who lives in a city, it will be affected. On the issue of neo-Nazis, I mean, the idea here is what Mr. Putin is saying is that this is a reference to what happened in 2014 during the Euromaidan revolution, and in which a very corrupt president of Ukraine, a pro-Russian president of Ukraine, was removed. And Russia proclaimed that he was removed unconstitutionally, even though 3/4 of the parliament voted to remove him, including members of his own political party. And in terms of this struggle during the Euromaidan revolution, there were, at the demonstrations confronting government troops, there were a number of far-right, Ukrainian far-right groups, and as a consequence of this, the Russian media painted them as all Nazis. This is not true. And in any case, the far-right parties in Ukraine failed to win any seats in the elections to the parliament in 2014 or after. So there is no neo-Nazi-led government of Ukraine. President Zelensky, who has a Jewish background, was elected by 73% of the people of Ukraine in 2019. He has he did have a mandate at that point. And at this point, in terms of his performance, has gained enormous popularity in Ukraine among all groups of people. So these kind of canards are often tossed out. And of course, in terms of this, you want to talk about the illogic of calling President Zelensky the head of a neo-Nazi government, is the other thing that that Ukraine should experience decommunization as well as denazification at the same time, which is somewhat of a contradiction. But propaganda does not necessarily rely on logic and facts. it relies on kind of touching emotional strings, which would persuade people to believe your point of view.
Yeah, and maybe just to add to that, I mean, I think this has to do with the also with the rise, like generally what's happening around the world with the rise of fascism. And fascism and anti-Semitism, if you look historically, have gone hand in hand, and especially so in Central Europe. So and Russia as well. So I think there's definitely some worrying trends that I wouldn't just say with regards to Russia and the Ukraine, but in general around the world.
Thank you. Thanks. Yeah, very good issues. Let me, another common theme in the questions deals with sort of Putin's domestic status, right? He's fighting an unpopular war, there are protests, the economy has instantly gone into financial crisis, there's lines at the ATMs. What do y'all think of Putin's domestic standing? There are a few questions about, could you see a coup happening? You know, dictatorships are usually very stable until they're not, right? Kind of want to see what y'all think of Putin's domestic standing. Where do you see things going in that direction?
Rob, if I can, I think that some sort of coup is not to be ruled out if the sanctions keep working effectively and if they are more targeted around the people who surround Putin. The problem is that he has reduced his inner circle considerably, and so he is relying on fewer and fewer yes men. And so it's becoming, it's also fairly difficult for for any of them to implement a coup. And even if there's a coup, you never know what kind of government is coming up next. Usually, most of the time, coups are carried out by the military, and you never know, what type of government is going to follow Putin. A better outcome would be for for the Russian people to get to the point that they are willing to take it to the street the same way that the Ukrainians did in several years ago, and that would be a more desirable outcome than actually a coup coming from the inner circle.
Yeah, I think it's a question that is difficult to answer if you're not on the spot. I think as an anthropologist, I would say, you need the local voice, what's happening in Russia. I saw some news items that show how he cracks down on any dissent. I saw one striking picture of an old lady who was in the shades of Leningrad, who was holding up two placards, against the war. And she was arrested by his police. And there was also a news item on a few children who went to bring flowers to the Ukrainian embassy with their parents, I guess, who were arrested and kept in a cell. I think this is just another point that we need to open up channels. We need to hear from the Russian people how they think. And so it's difficult, in my opinion, to judge what's going on, but we should definitely look at independent news channels. Any way we can get news out locally from Russia itself to hear what's going on, to form our opinion about this. Otherwise, it's a guessing game, I think.
All right, thank you. Thanks. We've got just a few minutes left, so I want to try to somehow end this on something resembling a high note, right? Which, yeah. Kind of like see, does anyone see any sort of reason for hope here? And also an issue of what can we do? Is there anything that can be done here?
So, I mean, I think that maybe, hopefully, fingers crossed, the talks about the corridor potential ceasefire, at least for, to bring in humanitarian aid, that might be, like a little bit of hope. And in my opinion, maybe some of the signs that there might be some dissent also in Russia. I agree with everything that was said in terms of Russia, Putin's position being pretty solid, but then like these forms of dissent can still eventually potentially lead to changes. And also in terms of what you can do, I put together a list of organizations that so you can support for Ukraine. I put them in the chat. I don't know if that worked. If it didn't work, please let me know if it worked. But basically, there's a number of organizations that look, there's medical support for victims, both international groups like Doctors Without Borders or International Medical Corps. Make sure if you do decide to donate to Doctors Without Borders, they are, from the ones that I looked at, the only ones where you can at the moment not designate your donation to be earmarked specifically for the Ukraine. All the other ones that are on the list have a specific Ukraine donation page. There's also general humanitarian help, obviously the Committee of Red Cross and so on. World Central Kitchen, for example, a nonprofit that provides meals to refugees. There's also a local Ukrainian-based humanitarian aid organization if you want to give to local groups. And there's a couple of organizations that specifically give focus on vulnerable groups, particularly children and also women. If you weren't able to get the list through the chat, I'll be happy to put it on our social media, so you have access. I've vetted these organizations, and all of them do good work and have specific crisis funds and support of the Ukraine. Some of them were also suggested by Ukrainian activists and journalists.
I appreciate you giving us all that just off the top of your head, I'm sure. That's good. Thank you for such a thoughtful and thorough response, because there's no shortage of scams that operate about trying to get money that's supposedly going to Ukraine. So thanks for sharing that with us.
Rob,
yes, go ahead.
Yeah,
Dr. Corbetta. Yeah.
If I can give a couple of reasons for hope from a strictly security geopolitical perspective. One reason for hope and one sign of optimism is the renewed cohesiveness of Western countries, and that's something that we have not seen in many years. And that if we can keep it up, that's going to be a positive development. Of course, if we don't shoot ourselves in the foot domestically, as some in the United States are trying to do right now. There's a second reason for hope is that the occupation and the invasion is not rolling out the same way that Putin wanted to. And so if in the next few days, you will see weaknesses from the US military, from the Russian military to become even more apparent, there's some hope for some sort of stabilization, at least on the ground. And the third reason for hope is, piggybacking on what Dr. Verbeek was mentioning, is the fact that, perhaps we're starting to realize that some issues like climate change and the development of green technologies are not just something that for environmentalists, but they are of a strategic and security importance, and that if we can get ourselves unhooked from the gas pump of Russia. In many ways, it will be good for everybody.
Can I?
Great, right quick. Go ahead, Dr. Verbeek.
Very quickly piggyback on that. Yeah, thank you, Dr. Corbetta. I'm totally of the same opinion. I think what gives me hope is that there's 145 countries in the United Nations who very clearly made a statement that this is wrong, that this cannot happen. So that's something to build on. I'm not as negative about the future of the United Nations. I think it can be reformed, particularly when we draw on the strength coming from, a great majority of countries that recognize that this is the wrong thing to do, and they can be mobilized to try to do the right thing. The final thing I want to say, going back to climate change, this report that just came out from the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change very clearly in its preface links negative peace with positive peace, as I defined it at the beginning of my comments. So you need to stop the violence, and that's what we're concerned with right now. But that's not where peace begins. It's ends. It's actually where it begins. Then you need to look further and look at what's happening within countries. And so I'm hopeful that when we can stop the killing, that we can get to that building on this consensus in the United Nations.
Thanks to you all. This has been, I feel like we've only sort of scratched the surface on this, but thank you so much for your, I think this has been a fascinating and important discussion, and I really appreciate it. Let me, I'd like to thank all the panelists for taking the time to share your talent with us. It's been a great discussion. Thank you, the audience, for the great questions. We're not able to get to all of them. Thanks to all our sponsors, and thanks to the captioner for making the session accessible to everybody. And again, thanks for all the great questions, everybody that's attended. Please let us know if you have any additional comments or questions, or even ideas for topics you'd like to see the IHR cover. And you could also contact the IHR on their Facebook page or by email at ihr@edu.com. And again, thanks to everyone for attending. It's been a great, not edu.com, no, okay, ihr@uab.edu. That would probably work better.
Close enough.
Okay. And thanks to everyone for attending, and hope everyone has a great day. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks very much.
Take care. All the best.